On the night of the 19th of October, 1986, the president of Mozambique, Samora Moisés Machel, a towering figure in southern Africa's liberation struggle, died when a Soviet crewed Tupolev 134 aircraft carrying him and his delegation crashed into a hillside near Mbuzini, in South Africa, just inside the border with Mozambique. His death remains one of the most controversial and politically charged events of the late Cold War era in Africa. It has been interpreted alternately as a tragic accident and a state-sanctioned assassination. In this eyewitness historian-style account, I will trace the background to the flight, the crash event itself, the investigations that followed, and the enduring questions of motive and responsibility. Samora Machel had been Mozambique's founding president, leading the liberation movement FRELIMO, Mozambique Liberation Front, from the 1960s and becoming president in 1975 when Mozambique achieved independence from Portugal. By 1986, Mozambique was under intense military, political, and economic pressure. Internally, the rebel group FRELIMO, backed by elements in the apartheid South African regime, was waging a devastating insurgency on Mozambican territory. Externally, Mozambique was aligned with the frontline states opposing apartheid and was a base of support for the ANC, African National Congress. In September and October 1986, tensions peaked. Machel publicly threatened neighboring Malawi, accusing its leader of allowing FRELIMO activities and vowing to close Malawi's route via Mozambique to Zimbabwe and South Africa. On the 6th of October, a landmine explosion killed 6 South African soldiers in the controversial Kangwane Bantustan, after which the South African Defense Minister, Magnus Malan, warned Mozambique of clashing head-on. Thus, when Machel traveled to a summit of frontline states in Zambia in mid-October, the geopolitical stakes were high. South Africa and its proxies saw Mozambique as a key backer of the anti-apartheid struggle and a threat to regional stability from their viewpoint. On the evening of the 19th of October, 1986, Machel boarded the presidential aircraft, a Soviet-built Tupolev 134A, tail registration C9CA, on a return flight from Bala, Zambia, after the summit, to Maputo, Mozambique, via a night approach. The plane crossed into the Lebombo Mountains region, near the Mozambique-South Africa-Swaziland border. In the darkness, the aircraft made a 37-degree turn off the expected track and descended into mountainous terrain at Mbuzini, South Africa, crashing on a hillside. It struck terrain in controlled flight rather than a complete loss of control. The wreckage was spread over a debris field, and only 9 of the 44 occupants survived. Machel was among the dead. The crash site is in the Mpumalanga province, formerly Transvaal, near Komataport, less than 1 kilometer from the Mozambican border. The aircraft's navigation radio had been tuned to a VOR, very high-frequency omnidirectional range, signal ostensibly from Maputo Airport, but the Soviet Mozambican side argued that a decoy beacon had lured the aircraft off course, a claim rejected by the South African inquiry. The South African authorities delayed officially notifying the Mozambican government of the crash by about 9 hours, and the initial response at the site raised concerns. Survivors' statements say that South African police and army units arrived early and apparently focused on swooping diplomatic bags rather than promptly rescuing survivors. Immediately after the crash, a tripartite commission of inquiry was constituted, composed of South African, Mozambican, and Soviet participation, plus oversight of the International Civil Aviation Organization-related standards. The South African Mago Commission, chaired by Judge Cecil Mago, the report published in July 1987 concluded that pilot error and crew failure to follow instrument approach procedures and heed the ground proximity warning system caused the crash, and found no evidence of sabotage, decoy beacon, or external interference. They objected to the South African-led report, arguing the investigation was biased and that the 37-degree turn into terrain strongly suggested manipulation of signals, specifically that a decoy VOR beacon, possibly set by South African security forces, misled the aircraft into the hillside. The Soviet side questioned the chain of custody of the recorders and the delay in access to the black boxes. Further, independent evidence and witness statements raised concerns. Survivors and investigators noted cut incisions on the necks of several dead persons, possibly to draw blood samples, and inconsistent treatment of the crash site. The credibility of the South African state's response was questioned, given the geopolitical context of the apartheid regime's hostility toward Mozambique. In the 1990s post-apartheid era, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, reviewed the case. While it did not issue a definitive finding of assassination, it stated sufficient evidence existed to warrant a new inquiry. Why would someone want to kill Samora Machel? His leadership's challenge to South Africa's apartheid and destabilization policies. Mozambique under Machel had been a thorn, supporting anti-apartheid activists, resisting South African influence, and threatening routes through Malawi and Zimbabwe. On the night of the crash, the region was also militarily sensitive. The plane flew through the border zone of South Africa's exclusion zone for civil aircraft, close to areas used for military operations and surveillance. South African Air Traffic Control had tracked the aircraft on radar, but reportedly did not warn the crew even when the plane was heading into a restricted, mountainous, high-risk zone. Machel had publicly claimed a recent assassination attempt and had set instructions in case of his death. Thus, some analysts believe that by eliminating Machel, an apartheid-era regime might have dealt a blow to the frontline state's unity, removed a high-profile figure, and furthered destabilization of Mozambique, which they already supported via Renamo. The decoy beacon theory fits this scenario. Luring the plane into terrain via false navigational signals would allow plausible deniability under the guise of pilot error or accident. Before we continue, like this video, hit the thumbs up button, and also subscribe to the channel for more documentary videos like this. If you have done it, let's dive in. The Margo report concluded that the aircraft was airworthy and the crew had significant experience. The crash was caused by the descent below minimum safe altitude and ignoring the ground proximity warning. Night approaches in mountainous terrain are inherently risky. The Lebombo escarpment is deceptive in darkness, and such terrain has generated other controlled flight into terrain accidents worldwide. Some declassified documents, e.g., French cables, hinted at pilot negligence or organizational mismanagement rather than external interference. Immediate proximity to South African border, air exclusion zone, and detected radar presence of the plane by South African systems. 9-hour delay in notifying Mozambique. Site visited by elite security units, removal of diplomatic bags. Survivors' testimonies of poor rescue efforts. Soviet and Mozambican investigators argued that a false VOR signal misled the aircraft, a tactic feasible in electronic warfare and consistent with suspected South African Special Forces activity. Mozambican and Soviet members withdrew from the commission, citing lack of cooperation. Important evidence may have been compromised or withheld. Judging the evidence, while a definitive smoking gun has never been publicly verified, the balance of credible testimonies and geopolitical context strongly supports the hypothesis of external interference rather than simple pilot error alone. The death of Samora Machel plunged Mozambique into deep grief and accelerated transitions. A monument was eventually built at the crash site, the Samora Machel Monument in Mbuzini, to memorialize the tragedy and those who died. In Mozambique, his legacy as founding father remains strong. Elsewhere, the crash remains a symbol of the interplay of liberation, Cold War geopolitics, and the murk of clandestine operations. Despite calls for reopening the investigation, no new definitive public inquiry has laid all doubts to rest. Later, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission remarked that though incontrovertible proof of assassination was lacking, the available evidence raised serious doubts about the conclusions of the original inquiry. Imagine a late October evening in 1986. President Machel boards his Soviet crude Tupolev, weary from the summit, but resolute. The mountainous Lebombo escarpment looms under night sky. The aircraft descends for home, but veers inexplicably in darkness. Moments later it crashes, lives lost, a nation stunned. For Mozambique, it was not just a tragic death, it was the loss of a symbol of independence and revolutionary hope. For Southern Africa, it highlighted how contested the airspace and the political terrain were between frontline states and the apartheid regime. The story of Machel's crash is thus both aviation tragedy and political drama. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you have not, and also like the video.